interesting. I just went to see this Star Trek movie, and it's such a sad, sad story. Anton Yelchin, who plays Chekhov in Star Trek, I believe, terrible, terrible thing. He was crushed and killed in a freak accident at his home in California. And there's been a lot of conversation about this now because his parents filed a wrongful death suit and product liability, I should add in there too, lawsuit against Fiat-Chrysler in the Superior Court in Los Angeles. The suit is saying that the gear selector in that 2015 Jeep was defective and poorly designed and manufactured. How do you go about proving that? And I think this is definitely great that they brought up this lawsuit, and I wonder how tough it is, again, to, with the burden of proof and going after, an automaker, how long that takes, all that kind of stuff. So joining us now from Los Angeles is Robert Ryan. He knows of such things. He practices his litigation in these areas and, of course, in California, and focuses his practice now on representing people injured or killed in accidents. Robert, thanks so much for spending time with us.
Thank you very much for having me, Kate. It's a real pleasure.
So they filed this. Well, first of all, let's go back to the accident. When you're the attorney, you got to get every single little detail about what went into that accident, don't you? All the accident reports, everything that you can piece together to put the crime scene together. I'll say crime scene, put together the accident scene in the mind of the judge or the jury if it goes that far.
That's right, but unfortunately in this particular situation, there are no known witnesses to the incident that led to Anton's death. All we know so far is that on the night of June 18th, he was supposed to meet some friends that evening and apparently had gotten into his 2015 Jeep Grand Cherokee in order to leave his property at his house in Studio City. When he did not appear for the scheduled meeting with his friends, they went over to his house and they found him pinned against a kind of corner column that anchored one end of his security gate with the Jeep pressed against his chest and his back against the column. LAPD investigators came to the scene and they determined that the vehicle was running, meaning the engine was on, and also that the transmission was in neutral. Now, it's important to note that Anton lived in a house that had a rather steep driveway, and so the supposition was that he had started the vehicle, had gotten out to go back into his house or to pick up something, and then by the time he came back, the vehicle had started to roll backwards, and somehow he got caught between the vehicle and the post, which led to his death.
Wow. So now you have all of that, and as you go after the product liability and the wrongful death, as an attorney, what do you have to do here to make this lawsuit viable, to win it, in other words? Well,
that's an interesting question. This scenario that I just outlined, for which is to some extent speculative about how this may have happened, is entirely consistent with a number of reported prior incidents involving that vehicle and that particular transmission. So let's step back a little here and talk about what the allegation is concerning the transmission in that Jeep model. It's something called a monostable E-shift, which is just a fancy name for a gear shift that doesn't actually move position to indicate that the driver has changed gears. I mean, we're all familiar with the gear shift in the middle of the console there that we unclick and rack in a slide, typically all the way forward for park and all the way towards us to drive. Now, those gear shifts were made in that fashion because the driver, under those circumstances, is actually mechanically changing the gears. Now, vehicles, like so much other products in our lives now, have pretty much been taken over by computers. So the driver typically, and especially in this car, doesn't actually mechanically change the gears. Instead, that's done electronically. But you still have this gear shift there that actually doesn't move now in this particular one, and the allegation is that it doesn't provide the same type of feedback to the driver to confirm that, in fact, he successfully put the vehicle in park.
So when you take on a lawsuit like this, when you're the attorney, do you just buckle in and tell the people that this could be a really long day in court? Because I would imagine it takes a long time for this to go through.
Well, in a case like this, you have Fiat-Chrysler, which is obviously, a multinational automaker. They sell vehicles in over 50 countries. They're one of the largest automakers in the world, and they're one of the largest corporations in the world. So you can anticipate that you will have a very well-funded and vigorous defense. But from the attorney's perspective, when you think about taking a case like this, the first thing you want to know is, has it happened before? And the plaintiffs in this lawsuit, who are Victor and Irina Yelchin, the parents of Anton, under California law, because he was not married and had no children, they would be the people entitled to make a claim arising from his death. You look back and you see, what is the history concerning this particular transmission and other accidents? And here's where we have a couple of factors that might play very much in Victor and Irina's favor. And let me talk a little bit about what those are. In August of 2015, there's a division of the U.S. Department of Transportation. It's called the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or NHTSA for short, began receiving complaints both over its website and from Fiat-Chrysler, who by law is required to pass along such complaints, that people were reporting accidents occurring as a result of this type of transmission not successfully being put into park, and then the vehicles rolling away and causing damages and, in many cases, personal injuries. In February of 2016, NHTSA expanded its investigation to include all Fiat-Chrysler models sold with this particular type of transmission, which at that time I think exceeded 900,000 vehicles registered in the United States. And NHTSA's investigation came to the conclusion that the design of this particular gear shifter was defective because it did not successfully advise the driver that the car might not have been put into park despite the driver's intention to do so, because the shifter didn't actually change physical position to indicate that. The only thing it did was there was a little light on the gear shift selector that lit up with a P that was supposed to tell the driver that it was in park. Now, there were a couple of features that Fiat-Chrysler built into it to try to alert the driver not to leave the vehicle if the vehicle wasn't in park. There's a bell that did a little ding-ding, and there's a light that flashed on the dashboard. But NHTSA determined that these safety features weren't enough to protect people who intended to leave their vehicle running, but just weren't aware it was in neutral and not in park. Now, that led to a recall by Fiat-Chrysler of this exact vehicle with this exact transmission. Unfortunately, a vehicle recall of that magnitude takes some time for an automaker to implement. If you think about it, first of all, they have to advise hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of vehicle owners of the problem. They have to schedule service times for all of those people to get their vehicles modified. But more importantly, what they have to do is they have to come up with a way to fix it. Now, it took Fiat-Chrysler until June of this year to come up with a fix for this particular problem. Unfortunately, that fix came too late for Anton.
Boy, yeah, no kidding. I mean, just a terrible thing. Of all the, obviously you decided to focus, as I mentioned, well over a decade ago, specifically on accidents, et cetera. And what has been the most gratifying part of practicing that kind of law for you? This particular lawsuit is a good example of it. Whether or not Victor and Irina win their lawsuit against Fiat-Chrysler, because they say that Fiat-Chrysler's defective design of this transmission caused their son's death, regardless of what you think of the merits of that lawsuit, and regardless of how it ultimately turns out, whether it's in their favor or not, it really stands for a very important principle that, for the most part, exists practically only in America, which is that you can have two individuals here who have a claim, obviously means a lot to them because it arises from the death of their son, and who can take on one of the largest corporations in the world on relatively equal footing. And whether they win or whether they lose, that stands for such an important principle of American justice, which is that anybody, no matter their position in society, if they have a legitimate claim, can bring that claim to court and seek justice. And regardless of how it turns out, that's a really important principle that all of us need to keep in mind. Boy, so true. I agree with you. Absolutely. What a pleasure speaking with you, Robert. We'll talk to you in the future again. Robert Ryan out of Los Angeles, talking about this terrible, terrible situation with the Star Trek actor, but the lawsuit that was filed against the car maker after what happened. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you so much, Kate. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. You have a good one.
Looking back, keeping track of the progress of the keeping of the ego intact. Before I realized I was a man.